I'm gonna tell you a story. It is not a story that I'm proud of. In fact, it doesn't paint me in a very good light at all. But I'm gonna go for it nonetheless. In my third year of teaching, I was a high school teacher before I was on staff here. And in my third year of teaching math, I was invited to be a part of this startup program. It was kind of like a school within a school. And I would still teach math, but I would also lead students through really cool projects. And we taught in a team. There was 10 other teachers. And it was awesome. And we started it, we built it from the ground up, and right away, it was working really well. The kids were doing really cool projects, but they were also doing really, really well on their coursework. In fact, their building data, the data that we collect as a building, the students in the program were far surpassing those of their peers. We were like, wow, this is really working. This is awesome. It was a lot of work though. It was a ton of work, and it cost a lot of money. We had to spend a lot of money on projects and all of the resources to make this possible, but it was working. And as time went on, we were not only exceeding the building standards, the students weren't just outperforming their peers in the building, they were outperforming their peers throughout the district and doing projects. It was awesome. It was really, really cool. It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows though. It was really hard work. And a lot of teachers didn't like it because it was such hard work. And we were talking about expanding and maybe other teachers participating, but not everybody wanted to participate because it was such hard work. So we were like, how do we convince people? How do we help them see that this is worth it? We thought if we could just get one really big, splashy success, then even though it's hard work, nobody could ignore it, and they would have to expand this. They would have to make this possible for more kids than just were in our program. So it was towards the end of the school year, and we were looking at state standardized tests, and we thought, perfect. If our kids are outperforming the building, and they're outperforming the district, if they can outperform their peers at the state level, then nobody can ignore this. And even though it's hard work, teachers are gonna have to get on board. We thought, that's it. So we poured ourselves into helping the students prepare for the state standardized testing at the end of the year. And we were working so hard. And the kids were doing great. And around that time, another teacher in the program who was also my friend gave me a copy of an old version of the state standardized test. I don't know where he got it. I still don't know where he got it, but I know for sure he shouldn't have had it. It wasn't the version for this year, it was an old version, but it was a copy nonetheless. And now I had it. And before I continue, I'll continue the story, but before I continue, I just need to make it really clear. Bright lines of right and wrong are really easy to see in the distance, and they are really dim and blurry up close. When you're looking out, way out in the distance, you're like, oh, that's wrong, and that's right, and that's, for sure. And when you walk right up to the line, and you're like, I don't know, am I on it? That's not the question to be asking, because you're probably over. And that's exactly where I found myself. I had the test, I thought, I don't know, we're doing a good thing. Our kids are crushing it. If we can help them prepare, not with a current copy, but with an old copy, and then they blow past their peers at the state level, that'll be it. They have to see that we've already been having success. This will just put us over the top. And so we used it. I used it. And it was really clear to see way out in the distance. It's really clear to see in hindsight. And in the time, I can tell you, it was wicked unclear. And it didn't get any cleaner and tidier from there. In fact, it got messier from there because not everybody loved what we were doing. It was a lot of work. They didn't want to participate. It was non-traditional. And one of the teachers who didn't really like our program saw the copy of that test on my friend's desk. And you can imagine how it unravels from there. It was messy. Messy's a kind word. It was really bad. There was talk of firing, and there was talk of lawsuits from the testing company. It was real bad. And I'll come back to the story. I'll tell you how it ends. It doesn't end real clean and tidy, but I will tell you how it ends at the end. But I want to actually go to David now because this is exactly where David is. This is exactly where David is when we pick up the story in 2 Samuel chapter 2. Jay told us last week, he preached through 2 Samuel 2, and he showed us how King Saul was killed in battle, and now David can rightfully become king. He's waited for 15 years. He's been on the run. He's been hunted like an animal. He has waited for what God promised to be fulfilled. And so we read, Jay read this last week, but it's worth repeating because it's where we start. We read in verse 4, and the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. This is huge. David has waited for 15 years. Have you ever waited for one singular thing for 15 years? Maybe. Have you been hunted like an animal living in caves during that time? Probably not. That was David's experience. He has waited and he has been bled out for this. And he's waited pretty well. Not perfectly, but he has waited pretty well. And now, here it is. It's like the door starts to open and he's standing on the threshold. He is anointed king in Judah, but he's at the threshold. He's not through the door. Because Israel wasn't a nation state like we think of today with borders. It wasn't like he became king in Judah and that means he was king over all Israel. Not at all. Israel wasn't a clean nation state with borders. It was more like a patchwork of territories. And Judah was just one territory in the south. He had a long ways to go. There were lots of territories where he wasn't king. Now, is it great that he was king in Judah? Yeah, it's the first step. But he had a long ways to go. So what's he gonna do? He's on the doorstep. God's promise waiting 15 years. It's about to be fulfilled. What's he gonna do? Well, he steps through the door and meets Abner. Because God's promise is not going to be fulfilled in its entirety right now. He's on the threshold, and then he meets Abner, starting in verse 8. This is where we pick up new today. We read, but Abner, son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim and made him king over Gilead and the Asherites and Jezreel and Ephraim and Benjamin and all Israel. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. But the house of Judah followed David. And the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. David gets Judah, woohoo! Abner makes a power play, takes Saul's son, and makes him king over everything else. That's supposed to be David. That's supposed to be David. David's like at the door. He's like, I've got Judah, cool. And then he steps in, he's like, but wait, Abner gets everything else? And it's not even like a legitimate kingship. Abner takes Ishbosheth and uses him like a puppet. Who's actually king over all Israel? It's not Ishbosheth. I mean, he is. He's technically Saul's son. He's the one with the crown, but who's pulling all the strings? Abner. Who is this guy anyway? I mean, Abner, why does he get what David was promised? Well, Abner took it. Abner had all kinds of power. Abner was Saul's bodyguard. I mean, Saul's dead now, but Abner was Saul's bodyguard. He was the commander of the army, and he had tons of clout. And he had tons of chips to cash in. So what does he do? He cashes in all those chips, gathers every northern territory besides Judah, and says, here you go, Ishbosheth, but by the way, I'm in charge. And so now David is standing on the threshold having waited 15 years. And how much longer did he have to wait? You might have missed it. 7 more years. That's a lot of waiting. That puts him over 2 decades of waiting for the thing that God promised he could have. So how's he gonna wait? He's waited pretty well for 15 years. How's he gonna wait for 7 more? And the answer is not really well. What we read in chapters 2 and 3 is really, really gray. It's really gray. Remember how I said the bright lines of right and wrong are really clear when they're like off in a distance. And then when you work really hard to get something that you want and you're willing to toe the line, those bright lines dim in a hurry and they become very gray. And that's where David finds himself in chapters 2 and 3. This 7 years is not David waiting, chillaxing in a palace. This is grinding waiting. This is confusing waiting. This is waiting in the midst of war. How do we know it's war? Because we read in chapter 3, verse 1, that there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. This was awful. And one of the awful things that we see is battle. If you look in verse 12, it says, Abner, the son of Ner, and the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon. What you read there, like the whole rest of the chapter, is just the account of a terrible, awful, really sad battle. You don't read the story of this battle and you're like, oh, I learned a whole bunch of great lessons about life and godliness. No, you read the story and you kind of want to cry. Because these are friends, and this is civil war, mind you. This is civil war. These are friends killing friends, neighbors killing neighbors, old men killing young men killing old men. And you read it and you're like, what is going on? This is the awfulness of people not living God's way. Should Abner have taken Ishbosheth and set him up as a king, a puppet king over all of northern Israel? No, that was David's right, and Abner actually knew it. We'll see later on Abner knew it, but he did it anyway. What's the fallout? Lots of people died. It's terrible. This is the gray, living in the gray, and this is the consequences for towing the line. And towards the end of the battle, something just really extra sad happens. And I mention it because it's going to play into how angry Abner and Joab are. Abner kills Joab's brother. Who's Joab? He's the commander of David's army. Abner and Joab meet in this battle. Abner is the king, well, not really king. He's using Ishbosheth as a puppet king. Joab is the commander of David's army. They meet in this battle. It's a terrible battle. And at the end of it, Abner kills Joab's brother right in front of Joab. You can imagine Joab's not real happy. Joab knows that this is supposed to be David's rightful kingship. This is supposed to be his kingdom. Why are we even fighting this battle? And now my brother's dead. This is messy on like a soap opera scale. This is terrible. It's messy, it's convoluted, and it goes on a long time. We know that. 7 years and 6 months long. So as David is fighting Abner, I imagine the wheels are spinning. I don't know this for a fact, but I imagine the wheels are spinning. David's thinking, I've got to work this from another angle. Like, the battle with Abner is not working. I'm going to have to work this in kind of a different angle, maybe a back channel. I'm going to have to get close to a line. Because what we read in verses 2 through 5 is kind of confusing. You get to verses 2 through 5 in chapter 3, and we read, and sons were born to David at Hebron. You're like, is this just another genealogy? Can we skip this part? No judgment from me if you skip these parts in your daily reading. This is interesting, though. Sons were born to David at Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon of Ahinoam of Jezreel, his second Chileab of Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel, the third Absalom, the son of Maacah. It just goes on. David has lots of wives and lots of kids in Hebron while he's waiting. And you're like, okay. It's kind of uncomfortable, but okay. This is interesting Because Deuteronomy 17:17, a passage of scripture that doesn't apply to most of our lives every day, applied exactly to David right then. Deuteronomy 17:17 says, the king, that's David, should not take many wives, for his heart will be led astray. David would have known that. He would have known that. Why? Because David knew the Torah. He would have known the king is not to take many wives, but has he taken many? It's like a lawyer wrote it. It's like, I don't know, how many is many? Can you define many? I don't know, 8 feels like a many. It's not even his first wife either. He's already been married. Michal was his first wife. She's not even here. Has he taken many wives? I think so. We aren't told explicitly. We don't see David get called out for this like he was called out by Nathan with Bathsheba. But I think this is David on the line. And when you're on the line, you're probably over the line. Why is he doing it though? Is he doing it for love? Was David just a passionate guy who wanted to be married to a bunch of people and have a bunch of kids? It's not even that noble. Not that that's noble. But it's not even that. Maybe David was marrying for love if coincidentally he loved women from powerful families scattered evenly throughout all of the northern territories happening to encircle Abner. It's just not possible. These are women from powerful families from northern territories that are applying pressure to Abner and Ishbosheth. And why is he doing it? He's doing it for good reasons. God has promised him all of Israel. He is doing the right thing. He's doing it in the wrong way. Is what he's doing good? It is. You can't say it's not. He is working for God's promise. Is he doing it the right way? I don't think so. I think David wanted to know how far he can go. How close can I get to the line? And I think when he got close, he realized it was no longer clear, it was blurry, and he was way past. And we're gonna see the downstream implications of this later in 2 Samuel. We're gonna see what happens to David's family. David takes 8 named wives. We don't even know how many unnamed wives there are. He has 20 sons. We don't even know how many daughters. David's family gets so large, he loses control. It's actually not David's undoing from the outside. David's undoing is from the inside. It's his family. I think this is the beginning of the slow fade. We look at Bathsheba and we think, oh yeah, that's the fall. The fall happened long before that. The fall happened long before that. I think David is willing to toe the line at this point in his life to get what God promised. But it's blurry. It's gray. It's blurry and it's gray because David is toying with the line. Let's come back to the passage. There's about to be a plot twist. We read in verse 6, there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of Abner. Abner was making himself strong. We're like, that's interesting. Abner's getting stronger. Shouldn't David be the one getting stronger? Abner is getting strong in the house of Saul, meaning Abner's actually strengthening his ties with all these political alliances that he's woven. But here comes the plot twist. We don't know exactly what happens, but when you read verses 7 down through 11, I'm not going to read it for you, but what you read in those sections is a massive plot twist. What we see is that Ishbosheth, who's the puppet king, accuses Abner of something terrible. He accuses Abner of sleeping with Rizpah. And we're like, who in the world is Rizpah? It's a good question. This is kind of like a soap opera. Like people are coming into view and we're like, oh, who is this person? But when you go back and you look at Rizpah, she was part of Saul's harem. That's a whole nother sermon for things not being done God's way. It's a whole nother sermon for things not being done God's way. But Saul had a harem, and Rizpah was one of the women in the harem. and Ishbosheth accuses Abner of sleeping with Rizpah. Now you're like, that's not cool, but I don't understand why that's a plot twist. Because Abner and Ishbosheth are cousins. That makes Saul, who's Ishbosheth's dad, that makes Saul Abner's uncle. So Ishbosheth is accusing his cousin of sleeping with his now dead dad's girlfriend. Did I mention this was screwed up? This is really screwed up, and it's a big deal. Now, did it actually happen? We don't know. We never actually know what happens. All we know is that Abner loses it. Absolutely loses it. He rips Ishbosheth to shreds, says, I've been loyal to you, which has he really? He used him like a puppet for 7 years. But he says he's been loyal, and then he says, and by the way, I'm done. And I'm taking all my territories, and I'm giving them to David. And now you see the plot twist. The plot twist is 7 years of war, and David's gonna get the kingdom without a drop of blood. But what's it gonna cost? It's gonna cost David making a deal with Abner. And who is this? I mean, like when you read about Abner, who is this guy? Is this a guy that David should be making a deal with? Because when I read this doesn't look like Abner being noble. This looks like Abner jumping ship. This is like, I'm getting pretty strong here. Ishbosheth, he's gonna take a dive. I don't wanna be on the sinking ship. David's gonna win. I'm gonna skip teams. If I join David's team, I can win. I'm not gonna win like this. I think I'll join David. You know what that makes him? It makes him a traitor. He set up Ishbosheth, used him as a puppet for 7 years, and then stabs him in the back. We don't even know if the accusation was true. Maybe it was. That's immaterial at this point. He jumps ship, which is all wildly confusing to me because it feels sleazy. He sends a messenger. Abner sends a messenger to David because he's not welcome to go see David, by the way. David would have killed him on the spot. Why? He's a sworn enemy. He's been setting up a rival kingdom for 7 years. He's not welcome to come see David, so he sends a messenger. He sends a messenger to David. We read it in verse 12. Abner sent messengers to David on his behalf, saying, to whom does this land belong? Doesn't that sound nice? He's been trying to take it for 7 years. Who does it belong to? Make your covenant with me, and behold, I'll hand it over to you. I'll hand all Israel over to you. I stop here, and it's like my jaw drops because it's like, is David gonna take it? Is he gonna make a deal with this guy? Everything inside of me wants to say no. Like last week we saw how scrupulous and principled of a leader David was. He killed the Amalekite messenger for lying about killing Saul. That's how scrupulous David is. He's not even gonna tolerate the perception that somebody killed the Lord's anointed. So he kills the Amalekite messenger. That's how scrupulous David is. Psalm 26 is an example of how principled David is. We're not exactly sure when Psalm 26 was written. There's good evidence that it was written early in David's life, long before this whole event happened. I choose to believe that. I think the evidence is good. I think David wrote Psalm 26 early in his life, and it describes how he sees himself. Look at this. He says in Psalm 26, vindicate me, O Lord, for I have walked in my integrity. And he did for a long time. When he was on the run from Saul, he did it the right way. For I have trusted in the Lord without wavering. Prove me, O Lord, and try me. Test my heart and my mind. For your steadfast love is before my eyes, and I walk in your faithfulness. Catch this. I do not sit with men of falsehood, nor do I consort with hypocrites. I hate the assembly of evildoers, and I will not sit with the wicked. I wash my hands in innocence, and I go around your altar, O Lord, proclaiming thanksgiving aloud. and telling your wonderful deeds. This is David. Is he going to make a deal with Abner? The enemy traitor? Yep. Yes, he is. And that's why my jaw is dropped. Because we read in verse 13, he, that's David, says, good, I'll make a covenant with you. And it's like I don't have words. I have read this passage hundreds of times, and every time I get here, I'm like, I don't even get it. Like, I don't get what David's doing. He has known for years, for decades, for 20 years now, he has known that if he will do things the right way, God will provide. He is now going to make a deal with a bad dude. And it gets even more confusing. Because David's going to use his position of power to use people like pawns. David tells Abner, he goes on to say, if you keep reading, he says, I'll make a covenant with you, continuing in verse 13, but you have to bring me Michal. We're like, oh, the first wife. The wife who you haven't actually mentioned up until now for 20 years. The wife who your father-in-law, Michal's dad, gave to another man to be married, which, did I mention that this story is all kinds of screwed up? Saul gives Michal to some other man to be married to get back at David. So now Michal is married to someone else. David says, I'd like her back. We have no record of him asking for her back up until now. But why does he want her back? Because he can tie this whole thing up, put it in the bag, and become king over all Israel if he has Michal back. Because Michal is Saul's daughter. It gives him legitimacy to all of the northern territories. Does David even care about her? I don't know. The text doesn't say. But I feel like if you cared about her, the time to go get her back was long ago. Not now. But he leverages a position of power and he says, because he knows that Abner needs this deal more than he does. What did Abner just do? He just lit a match, burnt the bridge, threw a grenade on it, and walked out of Ishbosheth. Where is he gonna go? David knows that Ishbosheth needs this more than that Abner needs this more than he does. So he says, great, yes, and bring me Michal. Which I look at David and I'm like, he's just moving people like pawns. Where is the mercy? Where is the compassion? Where is the love and leadership? I see David on the line, maybe over the line. And I say maybe because I have to be very careful here. We aren't told explicitly that David is in sin here. Nobody calls him out. This is history. This is telling us what happened. This isn't telling us how to live. So we don't know that he's in sin, but when I look at this as the reader, I'm like, David was just like toying with that line, and he was there long enough that pretty soon he's like, I can start moving people like chess. Which was never the way that God's leaders were intended to lead. But it goes on. It looks like it's gonna work. We can read ahead in the story and say, oh, the ends justify the means, but do they? Could not God have provided in a different way like he had all throughout David's life? But in verse 20 we read, then Abner came with 20 men to David. This is it. I mean, like, we are at the finish line. Abner comes with 20 men to David at Hebron. David makes a feast. He makes a feast for Abner and all the men who were there with him. And Abner says to David, I will arise and I will gather all Israel to my lord the king, that they may make a covenant with you, that you may reign over all that your heart desires. So David sent Abner away and he went in peace. We're at the finish line. We're not over the finish line. We're at the finish line because Abner still has to call all of his political alliances together. He has to bring them all together and actually give them to David, but he hasn't done it yet. And here's a plot twist to the plot twist. Abner leaves right as Joab comes home. Joab, who's been loyal to David for 20 years, fought with David when he was hunted like an animal. Joab, whose brother was killed by Abner right in front of him. Joab, who, mind you, has been away gathering supplies for David and Judah. Joab comes home and doesn't know anything of the plan. All he hears is that Abner was here, he got a feast, David made a deal, and he went away in peace. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see how this soap opera is going to play out. Joab tears David a new one. Tells him that he's a traitor, he's a spy, which he's probably not wrong. He just did it to Ishbosheth. And he doesn't tell David to his face, but I know that he's thinking, if you won't deal with this, I will. You know how I know that? Because he deals with it. He sends a secret message that David knows nothing about to Abner. Abner doesn't know it comes from Joab, otherwise he wouldn't have come back. But he comes back thinking, it's all cool, we're just gonna tie up this deal. He comes back. Joab meets him at the gate, kills him on the spot. Mind you, we're not over the finish line yet. David does not have the allegiance of the northern kingdoms. All he has is a promise and a dead Abner. Do you think the northern kingdoms are gonna give their allegiance to David when it looks like David got what he wanted and then killed Abner? No, that's not gonna happen. So what does David do? Does he at this point in time, David should realize, okay, all of my towing the line has led to plot twists and plot twists to the plot twist. I should realize I'm on the line. But you know what he does? He doubles down on the line. He throws an epic PR stunt campaign. Is he sad for Abner? I think he's sad that his deal got blowed up. I don't think he's sad for Abner. You know why? He's never cared about Abner a day in his life. He's been trying to kill him. But you know what he does? He throws the biggest, most extravagant funeral. David puts himself in the most prominent position, and then you know what he makes Joab do? Makes Joab join the party. Joab, who I can guarantee you isn't sad or sorry. But we read in verse 31 that David said to Joab and to all the people who were with him, tear your clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourn before Abner. And King David followed the bier. That's the funeral casket. This is for optics. This is so that David can convince the entire northern kingdom he had nothing to do with this. This is to make sure his deal gets across the finish line, that he can get the good thing that God has promised. And is it a good thing? It is. Did David do the right thing? He absolutely did. He is working for what God promised. Did he do it the right way? I think when we read this without putting David on a pedestal, I think we read this and realize he went about it in the exact wrong way. Because you can work for something that is good. You can work for something that is noble. You can even work for something that God has promised, and you can do it in the wrong way when you ask yourself the question, how close can I get to this line of sin without going over? I mean, I won't sin, I'll just get really close to the line of sin, and that'll be okay because I'm still in bounds. But here's the problem. When you get really close to the line, that bright, clear, crisp line, it fades into nothing. And you're gonna be over and back and forth, and it's gonna be in your rearview mirror before you know it. And that's where we find David. And it's where we're gonna leave him for right now. It looks like it's all gonna work out. Like everybody believes him. Like we go on to read in verse 36 that everybody believed him. Everybody believed him. And so the deal is gonna go across. Look, all the people took notice of it. And it pleased them as everything that the king did pleased the people. He's gonna get himself across the finish line. But did he do it the right way? No. And we look at a situation like Bathsheba, where we'll get to that in a couple weeks, and we're like, that's the fall. The fall started long before that. This is the slow fade. This is the slow fade. This is the crumbling of the foundation where David is willing to toe lines and willing to compromise. And when we read this, we have to read it correctly. This is not meant to be a playbook. This is history. This is not a prescription for what to do. This is descriptive of what happened. So when we read this, we don't read, oh, I should be like David in this, or I should do what David did here, or not do this. Because it's history. But can we still learn from it? And we can. I think we learn two very clear things. The first is to do the right thing the right way always. You can do the right thing the wrong way. I think if David were here today, he would tell us, no, it's not worth it. Do the right thing the right way. Wait for God to provide. Solomon, who was David's son, interestingly, through Bathsheba. Solomon, who was David's son, writes this in Proverbs 4, do not enter the path of the wicked and do not walk in the way of evil. Avoid it. Don't go on it. Turn away from it and pass on. Solomon, who would have looked back at David's life and seen everything that David did, wrote this. Don't even go on the path. If you can see a bright line off in the distance and you're like, that's sin, don't do that. But you're like, I've got a path that'll get me close. I've got a path that'll get me close, but it won't actually take me over. Solomon's saying, don't take that path. Don't take even the path of sin. But I think there's another lesson we can learn, and I think it's pretty clear as we read on in David's life, but I'll go ahead and make the point now, and that is that God loved David and was gracious to redeem his mess. Because we can throw stones at David all day long, and we like to sometimes. We're like, oh, David, how could you not know? Until we examine where we are and how many lines we've been willing to toe and cross. But you have to know that God still loved David even in his towing of lines and even in his mess. Not only did God love David, he was gracious to redeem his mess. We'll see God be faithful. Because David was faithful? Not a chance. Because God is faithful and he will redeem our mess. And if you're here this morning and you're like, I have made a mess of a situation, I have mixed motivations, I've been on the line, and I have just made a mess. You've got to know that like David, God loves you right now in your mess. Not when you clean up your mess, in your mess. And while there may be natural consequences, there may be downstream implications of your mess, God can redeem it. We know that. We know he can redeem it from Romans 8:28 that says, for we know that God works all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And maybe you're here this morning and like you haven't towed the line. You drove that sucker right on over. Like you're like, nope, saw it, crossed it, left it in the dust. And you may have train wrecked your life, whether recently or long in the past. And while David is kind of shady here, he is downright evil in future chapters. And God loves David even then. And he redeems even that mess. And so if you have a train wreck, like a true dumpster fire on your hands, you've got to know that God loves you in the dumpster fire and can and will redeem that. Because it's not that God doesn't care about sin. He cares about it. He doesn't look the other way. He can redeem our mess because Jesus was willing to pay the cost of the mess. And so if you will return to God in the ways that we don't see David doing here, but if you will come and confess to God who loves you and let him redeem, he will. And that brings me to my story and tying it up for you. It didn't have a clean, tidy ending, but I did spend a lot of time pray in that season, a lot of sleepless nights. For the first few days, nobody knew that I was involved. It was just this other teacher friend. And I haven't had very many sleepless nights in my life, but I had a couple then. And turning it over in my head and just praying through all of this, I regretted not seeing that line long before I got there. And I regretted having not prayed and asked God to examine my heart long before I got to this place. But it was too late for that. I was on the line, over the line. And so what's left to do then is do the right thing the right way. I was already doing the right thing. We were crushing it, but we did it the wrong way. And so what's left to do then is do the right thing the right way starting now. And so God convicted me hardcore that I had to go and tell on myself. I wasn't in the crosshairs. Nobody knew I was involved, but the right thing the right way then was to go and just spill the tea on myself and just tell my administrator what I did. And there was talk of firing and the lawsuits and all this stuff, and it was like, I'm gonna have to do it the right way, and I'm gonna have to trust God to provide. And I didn't get fired, and I didn't get sued, but I got in a whole lot of trouble. And I can chuckle now, not because it's funny, but because God is gracious. I got in a whole lot of trouble, and it was embarrassing, and it was maybe beyond embarrassing. It was humiliating. It was awful. But I was changed because of that. I learned that doing the right thing the wrong way is not worth it. I learned that doing the right thing the right way, and here's the thing, I think if David was here today, he'd say the exact same thing. I'm pretty sure that in the new heavens and the new earth, David will stand with us, sit with us, and say, I look back on that season of my life, and I was doing the right thing. But man, I wish I would have done it the right way. And so if you're here this morning, and you're like me in that you have asked yourself, how close can I get to that line? That's the wrong question to ask. Because the right thing, the right way is the way to live. And that's the big idea. That's the big idea from my story. That's the big idea from David, to do the right thing in the right way, always. Let's pray. God, we love you, and we are sorry for the times that we have towed the line. I am sorry for the way, God, I am sorry for the ways that I have towed the line. Because I've wanted to do the right thing in my own way. I've wanted to take matters into my own hands, and I'm sorry. And I'm sure many of my brothers and sisters have similar confessions, and so we just bring them to you this morning as an act of worship. We just bring our confession to you, saying, God, you are perfect and good. We love you. Please redeem our mess. And God, we trust that you will, because Jesus is good and powerful and paid for it all. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen.